Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hello everybody, welcome to memoQ Talks. My name is Mark Schreiner and I'll be your host for this episode of memoQ Talks. Today we're going to be talking with my colleague, Richard Sikes, who is a senior consultant for business services. But beyond that, Richard is also a man of many different talents. I saw him firsthand at our last face-to-face meeting out there on the dance floor, putting everybody to shame. I just looked at Multilingual's website, and I think that Richard has over 30 articles published there. And I believe that you've also achieved your instructor certificate for skiing. Is that right, Richard?
That's correct. In Canada, there's 4 levels. I have my level 2, and I'm working on my level 3 out of 4.
That is awesome. And you were at some place for a couple of weeks, someplace that I'd never heard of. Where was that?
A place called Kaprun, Austria. So I spent 2 weeks there getting some advanced training in December.
That is super cool, super motivational, and I'm envious. It's on my list. I just did my first ski trip this year, first time since college. Took my family up there. We were the rookie people on the slopes, but we were having a lot of fun.
Cool.
So Richard, before we get started, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what our business services team actually does.
Yeah, sure. Business services is a team within memoQ that uses the APIs and other facilities, capabilities that the memoQ offers for creating unique utilities to fill in functionality gaps that the core product does not offer. So as powerful as the core product is, our customers continually come up with new ideas of what kind of functionality they might need, and the business services delivers that. It includes connectors to content management systems, connectors to business management systems from some of our partner companies. Basically, it's a team of people that are really well versed in the inner workings of memoQ and the externally facing endpoints that the APIs offer, and they do pretty miraculous.
They do. And I want to put my sales hat on for a second here and just ask you one more question on that topic. Maybe you could give some examples of some of the things that your team, or it's no longer your team, but that team has developed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. We have, of course, created the interaction with a proprietary business management system from one of our customers that is the subject of this podcast, the linguistic validation part. It's a middleware solution that sits between that company's business management system that does the project management and memoQ as the back end. We have also created a front end for terminology searching and suggestion that is oriented toward the lay users, use case being a company. Let's say it might be a bank that has tens of thousands of employees, and they want to promulgate their terminology to the employees, mm-hmm. and also give their employees the opportunity to suggest terms. So we created an interface, a web-based interface that oriented toward the lay people, not linguists, right. Not trained translators, but you and me that or maybe I'm a bank teller, but I've got a really good idea about how something should be called, or I want to find out what something is called, that kind of person. So we did that. Lots of connectors. Another situation where we were able to save hours and hours of workflow and project preparation for a customer that needed to prepare project translation memories for external linguists that did not have access to memoQ. she was preparing those projects manually.
Hmm.
Created a way for her to create the translation memories for the projects with a few clicks, things like that.
That's awesome. And I just know that whenever a customer asks me, can you guys do that? And if the answer is, well, it's never no, it's no, not right now. Let me introduce Richard or somebody else from the business and service team, and we'll figure out a way to close the gap. And so you guys do some amazing work. We're here to actually talk about linguistic validation and
Mm-hmm.
how, the technology supports the workflows and processes, and how we at memoQ kind of
Yeah.
basically evolved our platform to support linguistic validation. So, if you don't mind, Richard, could you just give a brief overview of what is linguistic validation?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. It's a methodology.
Hmm.
It's been around actually since the later 90s. So it goes pretty far back in the history of software localization. Um, but it's not only software localization. It's a methodology that is largely serves the medical clinical trial regulated industries, um, where it's really important to have uh, detailed accuracy in the translation of content. Um, it makes use of both forward and back translation, and also a number of review steps that are really intrinsic to the process.
So when you talk
Um,
about forward translation, I'm sure a lot of people understand, but basically it's just a regular translation. You have your source text, you go into a target. But when you do the back
yeah,
translation, you're taking the target and then translating it back to the source to kind of compare.
yeah, that's exactly right. The theory behind it is that if the back translated content matches the original source, then you have a really squeaky clean, valid forward translation. If the back translation yields some kind of discrepancy, um, then that's an indicator that there's something afoul in the forward translation that needs to be remedied. Um, and the literature describing this goes back actually to '96, and uh, there's also a couple seminal articles were written in 2005 and 2010, so it's not all that old conceptually. However, there's a little bit more than just the translation. There's two goals really.
Hmm.
One is accuracy, but the other that's really important is contextual equivalence. And what does that mean? Uh, that means that a speaker of the target language reacts to the context in an identical human manner as the um, speaker of the source language. So
So
you could, in the sense that software localization, for example, is cultural adaptation, you can consider this to be cultural adaptation on steroids. It,
gotcha.
and there's a number of methodologies that involve kind of like focus groups
Hmm.
that that are given the translations to react to. It's a pretty stringent process. Um, so the goal there is not only just an accurate linguistic translation, but a completely cultural translation. There are other aspects of the review. There could be a clinician review, that would be a subject matter expert who is a native speaker of the target language. There can be um, an author review. There can be what's called a cognitive debriefing, which is a series of questions that pertain to the target content, and the interviewer asks members of a focus group to explain what that target content means to them. And if they come up with something that diverges from the original intention of the source author, then there's a problem that needs to be dealt with in the translation. So
So,
it's very, yeah.
oh yeah, already I'm sensing that there are potentially some very complicated workflows, and that different customers and even different projects within a customer's portfolio may require different workflows, and that if you had to manually set all of these up, it could be very time consuming and resource intensive. At the same time,
Yeah.
maybe we can touch, before we get into like what we did, maybe we can talk about some of the issues with document types, project types, that kind of thing.
Well, let's take a step back even further than that.
Okay.
In terms of the process, in order to achieve linguistic parity between the source and target, the linguistic validation methodology very often uses blinded forward translations and blinded back translations. By blinded, what I mean is you have two completely independent translators doing the forward translation, that is from the original source into the target, and they do not share translation memories. They don't see each other's work. They work completely independently. And then following those two parallel forward translations, there's a reconciliation step in which an editor takes the best of each of the two forward translations and puts them into one reconciled forward translation. Then that reconciled forward translation is put back through the process as a back translation. Can be single, can be double, dual, single or dual. And then there might be some form of reconciliation of the back translations. Or those back translations could be independently compared to the source. So it can be a very complicated process.
And I would like to say, for people who are watching or listening, that well, actually, it's just for people who are watching. Richard's going to share a brief presentation later on in our conversation here to give a little bit of visual structure to this, because what you just described, yeah, it does sound quite complex.
Yeah, it is. It also makes use of offline content. What is many of the reviewers of this kind of content are not translators. They're subject matter experts, or they could be people conducting the cognitive review focus group, and they need to have the content in a format that they can use.
So they can't just simply log into their favorite TMS or CAT tool and hopefully it would be memoQ, but because that's not on their on their desktop.
No, they don't have that available, or they don't have the technical skills to operate a CAT tool. So we needed to provide the content in the form of Word, which is Microsoft Word format, which is ubiquitous, and they make use of those documents, and so we export those documents to Word from the CAT tool from memoQ, and then after those documents have a place for commentary and corrections, and then we re-import those, and then the imported corrected target translations and or comments get assimilated within memoQ.
Awesome.
And compiled.
How about splitting projects?
Yeah. A project enters a workflow system generally with a number of designated target languages, and the project may also have a number of different documents. And so it's necessary to split these projects up into single target language projects. So you've got what you call a home project, which is it's got all of the target languages in there all together in one deliverable. But then for the actual working on those individual documents, then there are individual single source target language projects that are spawned, and then they go through that process, and then at the very end of the process, they get assimilated back into the home project for the deliverable to the customer. But over and above that, splitting of the languages, it may be that a particular document has a different set of workflow criteria than another document in the same project. So one document might require dual forward translation and single back translation. The customer may designate that no forward or back translation, well, forward translation is required, yeah, but no back translation is required. It all depends on what the customer wants, and our customer for whom we did this solution wanted to have the flexibility to adapt at a very granular level to the customer desires, and so we built that for them.
Again, I'm just thinking the complexity, and if you were trying to do this manually, and I could just see the project managers running for the exit, going, "Forget it, I can't do it." But on that specific point there, in terms of accommodating multiple documents that might have different translation requirements, do you want to talk a little bit about how we actually did that?
Yeah, well, to start with, we created what we call the home project, which is it's the project that gets entered in the system and it becomes the ultimate repository for the individual language projects. One of the very first pieces of the process is to evaluate the translatability of the source. And part of that is the segmentation of the source and looking for gotchas in the source that the project managers sense might become a problem in translation. So they try to create a really cleanly segmented, cleanly formulated home project. So that's that. Then we spawn off the individual projects. So that was one of the issues that we needed to deal with, just conceptually. How to have this big thing, then split it all off into the little things, and then put them back together again and into the big thing at the end. The other issue that we needed to kind of figure out was, well, how are we going to create a back translation? It sounds like it's simple, but actually under the hood, it's not all that simple. Mm-hmm. What you need to do is flip the source and the target, and then delete the original source, which is now on the target side. It might be possible to do it manually, but to do it in an automated way gets pretty hairy. So we have to export to an intermediate file format, and then manipulate that file format to flip the source and target, and then to delete what is now the new target, which was the source, and then re-import it into a new back translation project. So that was another issue that we need to deal with. Also, just dealing with the different document paths as it moves through the system. Like, as I mentioned before, some documents go through one path, and other documents go through another path, even though it's the same source and target language pair. So we had to figure out how to do that. And under the hood, there's something that's called a GUID. It's a universal identifier that's theoretically unique to any given document. So we track those GUIDs as the documents progress through the system, so we know what's going on where, and can put it back in the right place. And then finally, memoQ already had an export to RTF file format, which is a somewhat antiquated format, and we came to the conclusion fairly quickly that would not be adequate. RTF is very complicated in how it handles languages. There's complications with things like right to left languages, all kinds of issues. So we opted to create a completely new export and re-import format to the docx format, which is contemporary and serves the purpose well. You can do a lot more with docx than you could with RTF, so we had to completely redo that. And That was a big part of the project. The other thing is when you go to cognitive review, as I mentioned before, the reviewer might ask some questions, like 1, 2, or 3 questions. And so in the columnar format that these questionnaire forms have, we have to be able to adapt to 1, 2, or 3 columns. Generally, more than 3 columns gets a little bit too wide to be really practical to use, but it's theoretically possible to do. So all those sort of some of the technical challenges that we had to deal with in this project. It was a long project. It took 1.5 years.
Well, hats off to you and the team. I mean, it's super impressive. First off, you have to just get your mind around, what workflow requirements are there, but they seem to be kind of fluid, in terms of we might need this, we might need that, we might need one language, we might need several languages. And so, I mean, just to be able to kind of create that and develop it is really amazing. And I know that our customer has been very, very happy with it so far. I think now would be a good time just to add a little bit of structure to the conversation. So Richard's going to share his screen and to kind of walk us through a visual, I guess, outline of what he just described.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll share. Okay, so talking about linguistic validation. As I mentioned before, it's a methodology that's used in the regulated industries. It does involve single or dual forward and back translation, and it involves a number of reviews at various stages during the process by people like clinicians who would be subject matter experts but not translators. Then the cognitive review, which is a type of focus group where the subjects of the interview are asked to give their reactions to the text. And there's also proofreading that's done partially offline in the form of tables. So what we did, we had this project. It began in May 2021 and lasted over 1.5 years. And it was to incorporate memoQ into the business management system of our customer that's a very large clinical trials company. And that involved creating middleware to do certain kinds of special stuff, which I'll describe in a minute. And another part of the project, which I wouldn't talk about today, but it was a big part, was to migrate legacy translation memories from memoQ and from a competitive product that that company was also using. They standardized on memoQ. The background of this methodology is there's sort of 3 areas. There's the FACET, which was first published in '96. That's the earliest record of linguistic validation that I could find. Then there's the PROMIS technology, which stands for Patient Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System, nice acronym there. And then there's the ISPOR, International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. And they had 2 seminal papers, one published in 2005 and one in 2010. The goals of the linguistic validation are twofold. It's accuracy, that is linguistic accuracy, but also contextual equivalence, so that the speakers of the target language, readers of the target language, react in the same way as the readers and speakers of the source language. So, as I mentioned before, it's really cultural adaptation on steroids. Because here if you have a directions to a fibrillator, you want to make sure that the user of the fibrillator in a non-English speaking environment does exactly the right things.
Please. Please.
Yeah. So the process is pretty complicated. There's a simplified view of it here at the top of my screen where you see the concept elaboration. That's making sure that the source texts are really, really clear and localizable, translatable, written in clear English, that the segmentation is good. Then we move into forward translations, either single or dual, and then those translations get reconciled. And then there might be then the blinded back translation, where the back translators only, they work independently, completely independently of one another, as have the forward translators. And then there's a review of that. Then it goes into the focus group type of reviews by the instrument developer or the clinician, or the cognitive debriefing process, the sort of focus group process. And then it goes into proofreading and finalization. Now, the line at the bottom of my screen was the original workflow that we received from the customer, and as you can see, it's pretty small and wide. It's lots of steps. So if I blow those up, this next thing I'm going to show is my workstation at home where I work. When I blow up those little boxes to a size that I can read it, I have two 32-inch CAD-CAM monitors in my workstation at home, and that's what it looks like. You can see that it extends all the way across both monitors. The kind of beigey, orangey colored spots throughout those the diagram there are the interactions between the customer's business management solution and memoQ. So you can see that there's a lot of them there. Now, the other big piece of this was the review forms. As I mentioned before, often the users are not technically trained translators. Often they're subject matter experts or just local speakers of the target languages that get interviewed. So we needed to create a different set of forms for all of the different purposes. They fall into those 6 categories. There's two types of back translation review. One that has one back translation, and one has 2 back translations side by side in the form. Then there's the clinician, the cognitive, the proofreading, and the author review, and the client review. And those are all different forms. And here's the cognitive review form. memoQ generates these. They get populated with the content on the export. The kind of beige colored parts are where the reviewer can enter changes. And the right-hand one, the author comments, those get compiled and contiguously stored in memoQ, so the entire comment history is available. It's really important for the reviewers to be able to keep a track of all the comments, all the changes, and why things were changed as it goes along through the process. Then this is a document going through the process. It comes in the initial project. That's here, if you can see my cursor moving. It comes into the process, and this particular example has 5 documents. And then there's segmenting and pre-processing, and just the initial source language linguistic review to make sure it's translatable. And that goes into what we call the home project. And then the home project, all the documents get split up. If there's dual forward translations, in this particular case, all the documents get forward translated, but only 3 of the 5 get dual forward translation. And then for the reconciliation project, that is done by an editor using the translation memories, and then the projects go back into the target translation goes back into the home project. And then it's all ready for the back translation. That's all. All that's the first part of the process. So the back translation, the documents that are subject to back translation get flipped in a module that we call the flipper. Then some might get just single back translated, others might get dual back translated. In this particular case, in this diagram, we're following document B, which has 2 back translations. So the content arrives in the review form together with the source content, and the reviewer is looking for discrepancies between the source and the back translations. And here, for example, you see here in line 6, score, and one translator translated as goal. And in the French, it's but. I hope my pronunciation is right. And so the question is, well, is it a score or is it a goal? And what is the subtle difference between the two? That's where it becomes really important when you get into the cognitive review. Now, the various challenges that we had to work on, how do we create back translations? How do we do that? It's not a feature that's in memoQ. So how do we do that? So we created what we call the flipper, which exports the content to intermediate format, the MQXLIF format, and then manipulates that format to make what was the target, make it into the source, and to eliminate the source, which is now the target. So when it gets re-imported, you have the source as you have the target as the translatable content, and the original source language as the target. The other thing we had to do was figure out how to split up the projects, because they come in with multiple languages and they have to be split up into language pairs for the duration of the project, and get reconsolidated for the output to the customer. We had to figure out how to do that. So we came up with the concept of the home project that spawns just child projects. And then how to accommodate the projects that had different workflows for different documents within one project. Here's the example. The project's got 5 files, 3 get parallel forward, just 2, maybe different ones, require dual back, and 1 requires no back translation. This is all stipulated by the customer. So we had to build in the flexibility to cope with these different scenarios as the documents move through the system. And finally, the export functionality for the non-linguist review, those forms that I just showed a few minutes ago, we had to come up with a completely new export capability that memoQ does not have, the core product doesn't have, and still doesn't have at the moment. Maybe it'll get built in one day to export to multi-columnar format to generate those review files. So those are the challenges that we had to deal with as business services, and that was it. So, Mark, did I leave you with any questions?
No, just how did you do all that? I mean, that's pretty darn impressive, like I said, and hats off to you and the rest of the business services team. That's amazing.
Well, we had the good fortune to have Gabor Ubre, who is one of the founders of memoQ and is also a mentor to the whole development production organization. We had him intimately involved in the project, and he provided a tremendous amount of the technical guidance for all of the team. So we could not have done it without Gabor's input.
Well, hats off to Gabor as well. So no, I'm so impressed with our team and the ability. In fact, I was just speaking with a very, very large LSP yesterday that focuses on the regulated industries, and they don't currently have a tool that can automate these type of workflows, and it's because it's a lot more complex than it sounds. But actually, it sounds really complex. So I'm just saying it's next generation complex. So great job for you and the team.
Yeah, thanks. I'm pretty proud of it. As I've moved, and no longer the manager of that team, I've moved into my consultant role now. It's one piece of my legacy that I'm pretty proud of.
Moved into your consultant / ski instructor role.
Yeah.
I'll be there one day. I'll be there.
One of my ski buddies keeps saying, "Richard, don't waste the pretty. Don't waste the pretty."
Right. Good advice.
While your knees still can do it.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Richard, I really enjoyed the conversation and always like talking with you. And again, hats off to you and the team, and wish us all an amazing 2023.
All right, cool.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.